Your current footwear is likely a combination of synthetic polymers and polished leather. It's a far cry from the same basic need that drove humans to protect their feet from the elements thousands of years ago. From what we can tell, based on recovered bone studies, this primal urge to avoid pain was felt as early as 40,000 years ago. The transition to the first shoe was not a singular invention. There was no one original prototype. Instead, different climates dictated different solutions. Some early humans navigated frozen tundra, while others dealt with searing thorns. To trace the path from those first animal skin wraps to today's high-fashion labels, we have to examine the chemistry of animal brains and pigeon dung. That is how we actually started walking. Consider the ground beneath your feet. It is either biting cold or carpeted in thorns. For the first humans, footwear was not a fashion choice, but a survival requirement. Physical evidence of this early protection appears in 40,000-year-old Chinese skeletons and cave paintings in Altora dating from 15,000 to 12,000 BC. In Spain's Cave of Altamira, 15,000-year-old depictions show humans utilizing animal leather and fur. The initial solutions were rudimentary. Early footwear ranged from animal furs wrapped around the feet and calves to palm leaves bound beneath the sole. Depending on the environment, these cold climate wraps were the precursors to boots, and the hot climate versions were prototypes for sandals. It was a simple matter of physics. If you cannot walk on a frozen tundra, you cannot hunt. If you cannot hunt, you cannot survive. The ground was the enemy. Eventually, the habit shifted from simple wraps to more intentional structures. The Teutons and Franks, for instance, utilized primitive foot socks made of untanned fur that reached up to the knee. Essentially, it was a warm tube of animal skin. But then the design evolved. Around 500 BC, these groups began wearing tied peasant boots made of leather and secured by a long strap. This was not an attempt at high fashion. It was a basic engineering solution to prevent a piece of leather from sliding off a foot while trekking through mud. You had a piece of skin, a strap, and a very determined need to avoid frostbite. It is a remarkably simple system that worked well enough to keep the species moving. If we examine the specific engineering of prehistoric footwear, we find fascinating structural logic. Take, for instance, the Irani 1 shoe from Armenia, the oldest leather shoe ever found, dating back roughly 5,500 years. It is a simple one-piece leather wrap, but it is perfectly calibrated for the terrain. Then there is Otzi the Iceman, whose 5,300-year-old footwear was a masterpiece of prehistoric utility. His shoes were made of bear and deer skin, stuffed with dried grass and hay to provide thermal insulation, effectively a prehistoric puffer jacket for the feet. This wasn't just wrapping skin, it was a deliberate layering system. When you look at Otzi's gear, you see the intersection of survival and an early form of architectural logic. It is effectively a leather tool for the feet, designed to maintain mobility across difficult terrain without the luxury of a modern heel. Raw hides are useful, but they possess a structural flaw. If you wrap a piece of animal skin around your foot and it gets wet, it does not stay soft. Once it dries, it transforms into a stiff wooden board. Alternatively, if left untreated, it simply rots. This is the false tanning problem. To prevent the leather from turning into a rock, early humans discovered that they needed to introduce fats. Specifically, they began rubbing animal brains and oils into the skin. This process breaks down the fibers and keeps the material supple. It is a pragmatic solution, although it means your footwear is essentially marinated in organ meat. Later, as styles evolved, the requirements for leather changed. By the 11th and 12th centuries, kid leather became the preferred material for shoe shafts. It was softer and more refined, moving the industry away from the primitive brain-soaked wraps of the Paleolithic toward something that actually resembled a garment. While brains worked for a few, The real industrialization of leather required more aggressive chemistry. To turn a rotting hide into a durable material, ancient tanners used a process called liming. They soaked skins in alkaline solutions, often using urine, to remove hair and fat. This is where the process becomes truly olfactory. In places like Fez, Morocco, the traditional tanning process still involves the dung kneading method. Hides are placed in vats filled with a mixture of pigeon dung and limestone. The ammonia in the pigeon droppings softens the leather, making it pliable enough to be dyed and worked. It is a highly efficient chemical reaction, though it means the foundations of the leather industry are built on a base of avian excrement. Ancient Egyptians applied this logic to their environment by inventing the sandal. They used precisely calibrated leather straps, including a diagonal shaft strap running across the back of the foot, to ensure the footwear stayed secure while moving through shifting dunes. It was a shift from simply surviving the ground to designing a tool for a specific landscape. By classical antiquity, footwear had stopped being just about avoiding thorns. Shoes became social rank identifiers. The choice of leather was no longer a question of survival, but a clear signal of power and status. The Roman sandal, for instance, was distinguished by a series of straps ascending the leg, which marked the wearer's place in the social hierarchy. For those requiring more coverage, there were sandal boots with lacing that extended up to just below the knees. Then the gear changed. In the 4th century, regular boots arrived in Europe from the Far East. Originally, these boots were reserved for men. However, the world began to move. Mass migration from the 3rd to 6th centuries and the Crusades from the 11th to 15th centuries acted like a giant blender, mixing disparate footwear fashions across continents. People were not just protecting their feet anymore. They were wearing a map of where they had been. Around 500 AD in North and Central Europe during the Middle Ages, leather shoes were crafted using the turnshoe production method. This was a logical solution to a recurring problem: how to protect the seam. The process involved stitching the shaft and sole inside out and then turning them facing outwards. By doing this, the seams remained on the inside, hidden from the abrasive ground. It is a design of almost surgical precision. Later, by the late Middle Ages, the Goodyear welting precursor began to emerge. European master shoemakers developed the welted rand method, creating a complex structural bond between the upper, outsole, and insole. While this was formalized into the Goodyear welted shoe between 1880 and 1889, its roots lay around 1500, providing a structural integrity that raw wraps could never achieve. Heels were invented in the 16th century, arriving in Western Europe via a Persian diplomatic mission. Initially, the goal was purely functional, keeping the foot stable in a stirrup. This was a purely functional goal. Initially, the goal was purely functional, keeping the foot stable in a stirrup. Then the logic shifted. In Spain, women began wearing shoes with platform-like soles, and a trend that spread rapidly to England, France, and Italy. This was no longer about thorns or cold ground. It was about height. In Venice, this reached a peak with chopines. These were extreme platforms with heels up to 40 centimeters, roughly the height of a standard bowling pin. At this height, walking became a secondary concern. Chopines required the wearer to be accompanied by a servant or to use poles to avoid falling over. It is a very specific kind of progress to design a shoe that makes it physically impossible to walk without assistance. By the 19th century, the foundations for modern men's shoe fashions were firmly set. Men primarily wore low-rise shoes, leading to the creation of classic models like Adelaides, Chelsea, Balmorals, clogs, pattens, and sabots. In the 16th century, we had already seen the emergence of duckbell, cowmouth, and bear claw shoes, all of which utilized Goodyear welting. Then the 20th century arrived and the industry shifted entirely. However, a pivotal change occurred earlier in 1858 when chromium salts were introduced, leading to chrome tanning. This replaced vegetable tanning by using chromium salts to significantly reduce tanning time and produce supple, durable leather. Combined with the 20th century's development of thermoplastic rubbers and synthetic materials, this led to massive cost reductions. We went from months of processing hide to a few hours in a chemical bath. We have traveled from the Paleolithic era, where the only goal was to avoid a punctured foot, to a global industry producing 14 billion pairs of shoes annually. It is a strange trajectory. We began by rubbing animal brains into hides to keep them from turning into rocks, and we spent centuries perfecting the art of hiding seams by sewing shoes inside out. We saw the transition from the functional stability of a Persian stirrup to the 40-centimeter platforms of Venice that required a human escort just to cross a room. We moved from the ammonia-scented vats of pigeon dung in Morocco to the chemical baths of the industrial age. Today, we pay thousands of dollars for designer leather and precision stitching, which is essentially just a highly refined version of a survival tactic used to avoid thorns and frozen mud. We have spent 10,000 years evolving our footwear, only to end up exactly where we started, trying to keep the ground from hurting us.